I wonder how you're doing this morning. I wonder how you slept last night. How is your body? How is your heart? How is your spirit? Take a moment to notice for yourself, if you're here in person with others, if you're at home joining us, if you're online somewhere else, how are you doing? There'll be as many different answers to that as there are people. But if you're doing really well today, or if you're struggling, or anything in between, you're really welcome. The conversations I've had with many people as this new year has begun, it's only 3 weeks old, is that there is quite a lot of anxiety around and not a little despair with the multiple crises and challenges of 2024. And so it may be that this gospel story, the amazing gospel story we just heard of the wedding and Jesus changing water into wine, it might seem particularly fanciful in such circumstances. But I hope just in the next few minutes to reflect on the profound good news that this gospel brings to you and to me personally, to our church community and to our society, even as the year starts in such uncertain and challenging times. For the church, this most strange of incidents in John's Gospel is the latest in a series of stories that are interpreted as an epiphany, literally an uncovering or a revelation of who God is, of who Jesus is. The first epiphany was at Jesus' birth, at the visit of the Magi, and you'll see that in front of us in our nativity figures. The arrival of these astronomers from the east that indicated that there was something stellar, something heavenly about this child that was not apparent in the poor circumstances of his birth or his ordinary family. The first epiphany. The second was 30 years later, after Jesus had been living and working, probably as a carpenter in Nazareth, when he seemingly suddenly began to speak and live more publicly as a teacher and healer. He went to be baptized in the River Jordan by his son John, the second epiphany. And this wedding at Cana in Galilee is the third epiphany, the first time that the community recognizes that to be with Jesus is to learn to expect miracles. But reading the really beautiful but mysterious story of this wedding at Cana, we can let our anxiety or skepticism about whether something weird really did happen to that water, we can let this obscure the deeper truth of the story. So let's not do that, but go deeper. Jesus told lots of stories about weddings because the image of a wedding feast was a powerful way of describing both the culmination of everything and also the start of something new. In Old Testament and Jewish literature, a wedding feast is the final celebration, the language of covenant and promise. The relationship is theologically often used to try to describe something close to how human beings and God might relate to one another. So Jesus told a number of stories about feasts at weddings. We have the wise and foolish virgins with their oil, the story of the king who throws a huge party for his son and no one turns up. The story of the wedding guest who's thrown out because he's wearing the wrong clothes. The story of the master who returns from the wedding banquet to find his servants ready or not. The guests who chose higher or lower places at the table, and so on. The complexities of organizing weddings. Spiritually, the meaning of Jesus' many stories about weddings isn't just based on the description of an actual wedding. And it's important to say that, as there are many here who would find that painful or excluding. Not everyone has a wedding. Not everyone wants one. Some would have loved to have had one, and it never happened. And many other LGBTQ plus people yearn to have their wedding in church and can't. So we can't limit reflections today to actual weddings. That's a sermon for another time. But so many stories about these celebrations point us to a way of talking about God's presence in the world and revealing to us, uncovering to us what that's like. God's presence in the world is marked by celebration, coming together, union rather than division, love more than hate, by the human desire to make promises and make vows, by our God-given desire to give ourselves away. This way of life, characterized by these things, mean that Jesus' parables about and attendance in this case, weddings, is a way for all of us to talk about the kingdom of God, a way for all to join in the broken-hearted celebration of this Eucharist, a place of justice, mutuality, peace, and celebration, where everyone is fed and all have more than enough. John's Gospel is very different from the other three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John's Gospel has different stories, new characters, a cohesive set of poetic themes that are elemental, beautiful, thoughtful. John's Gospel is playful and exuberant and fascinating, teasing us with plays on images of light and darkness, wine and food, the oneness of all that lives and has lived, meditations on time and eternity. If Mark's Gospel, the oldest and shortest, is a sort of a breathless account of Jesus' tumultuous 3 years, with actually in the first text no resurrection at the end, that's another sermon for another time, then John's is an extended meditation on the deepest possible meaning of living, framing the widest possible embrace of mystery, uncertainty, beauty, and suffering. In truth, what it's like to be a human being in the world. John's Gospel has layers and layers of meaning. It's no good taking it all at first glance. In spending time with John's stories and with John's Jesus, we are quickly and gloriously out of our depth. John's Gospel is a gospel for when you just don't know what to do, for when the world seems prosaic and grim, cold and unforgiving. John's Gospel won't give us easy answers, but gives us stories to help us live with our questions. Why don't you take this week to read John's Gospel? Just read it through all at once, or in 2 parts maybe. Try to read it slowly. See what effect it has and how it takes root in you. Reading John's Gospel means we don't always see the meaning at first glance, but we hunt for clues. The first clue to the meaning of the story we heard today is that we join that wedding feast on the 3rd day. So we're pointed to the meaning of this celebration as one that inaugurates a new promise between people and God, a new covenant. The symbolic action, replacing water with the finest wine, not just any old wine, but much better than the guests had been drinking before. New wine stands for new promises and new life. Jesus is not performing a magic trick. If magic is what this story is about, then surely he wouldn't have needed any water to begin with. Wine could be conjured up out of nothing as surely as transforming water. It's not described as a magic trick, but as a sign. The guests are celebrating. Jesus is celebrating with them, and it's been 3 days of dancing, eating, and drinking. Jesus is there with his family, and his mother tells him the wine has run out. Jesus is curt in response. The literal translation of what he says is, "What is there to you and to me, woman?" It's the same thing said to Jesus by the man possessed in the synagogue in Mark's Gospel, when what the Gospel calls demons shout at Jesus, "What is there to you and to us? What is there between us?" Jesus is at best grumpy with his mother, and really more evidently, downright rude. Why? Because another of John's themes, timing. My hour has not yet come, Jesus says. It's strange for us who will still have the Christmas pictures in our mind's eyes of Mary with Jesus as a baby to hear him as a grown-up dismissing her in this way. However you read it, it's a bit of an argument between son and mother, and we can't escape the fact that out of this abrasiveness, a miracle occurs. Agreeing with one another seems not to be a requirement for people of faith, for miracles to occur. A particularly relevant reflection in this week of prayer for Christian unity. And this sort of sharp exchange between Mary and Jesus doesn't in the end prevent her from standing at the foot of his cross a few years later, or prevent him from ensuring that she's cared for after his death, creating a new relationship between her and his beloved disciple John. For as much as Jesus is sharp with Mary, she rather brilliantly seems to ignore his rebuke. She's marvelously free of her son's criticism. She does her own thing. Inspirational. Jesus has told her he's not ready, but she carries on regardless and simply says to the ones who are serving the food, "Do as he tells you." The amount of water that becomes wine when the head steward draws it is significant in the gospel story. It's far too much, about 120 gallons, and it's the best wine. Echoing the prophet Amos, "Behold, the days are coming when the mountains shall drip sweet wine and all the hills shall drip sweet wine." It matters who we are and how we live as to how we hear this gospel and for whom it is good news. The promise of joy, the promise of fulfillment, the journey towards wholeness and reconciliation of the whole of creation is a trajectory, a direction of travel for the whole of our lives. It's not so much about how we feel, but more about what we do in love. It's a decision to live in love and to want to deepen our experience of living in the world. And this is where some of the attrition of this gospel will start to hurt. How can we today indulge ourselves in what seems like a whimsical story about wine in a world where for many populations there isn't even any water? The suffering of so many people in Sudan, Myanmar, Ukraine, the people of Gaza who've been forced south are now being bombed there. Never mind wine, there is no water. In this place of vows and solemn undertakings, in this place of generous promises and pledges for an unknown future, we do not pretend that life is perfect. How could we? This gospel is not a fairy story, nor is it a manual for magic. The church is a safe place to remain resolutely aware of the selfishness and cruelty of which every one of us here is capable. The injustices of the world, the catastrophes, personal, global, and the appalling griefs that many carry, maybe you carry, to this place and this altar. In John's Gospel, in the Epiphany of gifts and signs and miracles, God makes promises, not for an easy life, or even for a straightforward life, and certainly not for a suffering-free life. There is glory and suffering in your present and in your future, as there is in every person who is fully alive. No, in amidst all the politics and the debate, the getting by and the losses we carry, it is love. That's the irreducible core of what we are doing today. Like at the wedding in Cana of Galilee that Jesus went to, God's promise is to invite us to live expecting to see signs and glimpses, hints, indications of love in the midst of grief, of generosity in the midst of scarcity, and deliberately to put ourselves in the way of that living. Gently, our tender hopes can be transformed as water was transformed into wine, into an intoxicating call to live well, and with thankfulness for the immense gift of love that God gives to us. The wine that we drink today at the Eucharist is from a cup of suffering. The cup that in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus begged to be passed from him. When we drink this wine, share it together, we share in the suffering of God who suffers with humanity. And in sharing this wine, we learn again to mirror the action of God in the world by pouring upon the suffering people of the world, which includes us sometimes, the new wine of compassion. And so may the water of our tears at the beginning of this new year turn into the rich wine of compassion by God's grace, as we ask God to give us strength to overcome our sense of helplessness or despair and live lives of generosity, imagination, and tenacity, to help us live as those who will always look for transformation, live with the deep uncertainties of life and faith, not try and look for false certainties, but learn every day to give ourselves away. Amen.